So, your teachers probably told you in the past, Wikipedia is not a good place to go for research. Now, you're wondering, why did they tell me this? Here's a good reason why. They didn't want you to use Wikipedia as a crutch. They didn't want you to just be able to go to Wikipedia and think that, all right, that has everything that I possibly need. Now, a lot of people seem to think that Wikipedia is editable by anyone, and so anyone can change information at any time. And while that is true, it's not like I could go and change the Titanic Wikipedia page, and then 5 seconds later, that information is published to billions of people throughout the world, and now people might believe something that I wrote on there. And that's not how it works. There are thousands of people who are volunteering or working for Wikipedia, who every time an edit is made, they review it, right? And so they double check that with other legitimate sources to make sure that whatever edit I might have made, that it was accurate and true. And if it's not accurate, they don't even let it go on to the Wikipedia page. Now, I will tell you that sometimes Wikipedia will have something that might say like citation needed. Now, if you look at like where these little numbers are, these are all what's called citations. Those are websites or books that prove and verify that what you're reading on here is true. That's why Wikipedia is so great. Now, you can't, however, right? And here's the danger of telling a 7th grader how great Wikipedia is. I don't want you to think that when I tell you that Wikipedia is great, that it should be the only place that you go for information, that Wikipedia is the place where you go to confirm all information. That's not what I'm looking for. And I don't want you to think that like you can basically just read a Wikipedia page and know everything that happened, because that's just not the case. These are written by people from all over the world who kind of patch things together. There's a lot of stuff that's missing sometimes, and there's a lot that's just left out. In addition, right, Wikipedia is itself not a resource. Wikipedia is a website that has a bunch of resources that you can go and access, and I'll show you what I mean by that here in just a second. So let's clarify what I mean by the word resource. So your goal in your research paper is to find a bunch of information from books, from websites, from articles online, put it together, and tell me about your topic that you're researching. And you'll need to find resources. An example of a resource might be a newspaper article from the New York Times, or it might be your history textbook, or it might be a biography of a person that you're researching or someone who's involved in that. Those are what are called resources, and that's what I'm going to be looking for. Now, why? Because when someone does research, right, in order for them to prove to the readers that it's not made up, they need to say where they got their information from. It's called citing your sources. It proves that you didn't make something up, or embellish, or add on to something, or take liberties with the truth, right? It shows that what you have written is factual. So, you'll never, ever, in high school and college and middle school, you'll never cite Wikipedia. So I'm gonna ask you, right, to cite the link that you got your information from when you write your paper. They will never have Wikipedia in the link. And you're like, well, Mr. Tom, you're telling me Wikipedia is so great. How come I can't use Wikipedia? Because as I said, Wikipedia it's a hub of sources. It itself is not the source, and I will show you what I mean. So, let's say that I tell you, right, that the Titanic only had 20 lifeboats on it, and they were only enough to carry about half the people that were on the ship. You might believe me because I have shown that, like, I, am an honest person, but I could be dishonest. How do you know that I am telling the truth? Well, I tell you, hey, I found that information right here. Hey, Mr. Jones, you said you can't use Wikipedia as a source, and here is where Wikipedia shows you why it is so great. These little numbers right here. Look at what happens when I hover over that number. It says Vanderhook as 2008 Titanic. Now, when I read that, you know what I see? That's a book that was written by someone who researched the Titanic. Those words, publishing company, tells me that was probably a book. Now, that number, it's not just something you hover over. You click on that number. And what happens when you click on the number, it brings you to the bottom of the page. So let's click on it. Boom. And then you see all these numbers. And this is why Wikipedia is the greatest source of resources that we have ever made as human beings. All of these sources here are books, newspaper articles, research investigations, research papers, you name it. These are all sources that say, hey, this is what happened on that Titanic. So it says, all right, let's look at this one from New York Times, a really good resource. I click on it. Where does it bring me? It brings me to the New York Times newspaper archive. And look at this. This is the newspaper from the day after the Titanic sank. Now, you're not always going to have access to some of these pages because they do want you to pay for them because they worked hard for it. But this shows you that Wikipedia, right? All these tiny little numbers, everywhere you see 264, right, and 145, these all lead to actual sources that say, hey, Wikipedia is a place where we can send our information and we'll prove that it's right by including these links so that you know there's no mistaking that this is accurate information. Now, in order for something like this to get on there, any of these sources, many people who work for Wikipedia or volunteer for Wikipedia, most of them are volunteers, they will like go and double check that source and be like, hey, let's just make sure he's telling the truth. The only tricky time when Wikipedia can be maybe not super trustworthy is like an event that's happening like right now. So, for example, let's say the Trump impeachment trial, the second one just ended yesterday on Saturday as I'm recording this video. Wikipedia, I probably wouldn't go there for information right now unless I really know how to search for all these sources, right? And when you don't see one of these numbers at the end of a long sentence that has facts and statistics in it, you might want to pause and question it because you're saying, hey, well, where's your source? Where are you getting this from? Now, if you're wondering, why do I sound so impassioned about this? This is what I wrote my thesis paper in graduate school on. It is very important that you know how to discern, how to tell the difference between something that is true and something that is embellished, fabricated, or false, right? That is, to me, one of the biggest dangers facing your generation, besides climate change, is misinformation. It's very important that, we know what sources to trust and what sources to be skeptical of. And skepticism is healthy. It's important that you don't just believe anything that you read. But just know that in a Wikipedia article about a boat sinking that happened 109 years ago now, with all of these 300 sources, that's going to be a great place to go. So there's my little Wikipedia spiel. At the end of the day, the biggest lesson to take away from this is Wikipedia itself is a hub of resources. It has a bunch of resources that you can then go to, and that's what you'll cite. That's what you'll say, hey, this proves that my paper is full of facts. And the second thing is, you are not copy and pasting from Wikipedia. You're not copy and pasting and changing this word and that word and this word. You will write research in your own words. You will not copy and paste from Wikipedia. You'll take that information, you might read this whole paragraph and summarize it, right, in your own words, but you would still then tell me, hey, okay, this is from Inside the Safety U.S. Military Mission that located the Titanic, right? You'll click that link, and then that'll be your resource. This CNN article will be your resource. Okay, that's all I got for Wikipedia. Thank you, and enjoy researching.